Alright, so today we're going to talk about types of government. But what is a government? Well, a government is an organization that keeps order, sets rules, and provides services for a society. First, we're going to talk about limited government. A limited government means that the government has limits. This means the people have voting rights. That means they can vote for things like presidents. People can also elect representatives to do what they want them to. And that means the people, or the citizens, have the power. All of these people can vote in and out whoever they like so that they can accomplish what the people want accomplished. Some types of government include democracy and constitutional monarchy. These are two types of limited governments. Countries that have these include the United States of America, of course. We have a democracy. And Great Britain. Great Britain has a constitutional monarchy. The other type of government is unlimited government. This means the government has no limits. The government can do whatever it wants, whether the people like it or not. This means there are no elections, or they are corrupt elections, which means people cheated. There's a strong military intimidation. That means if you don't do what I want you to and I'm the leader, I might run you over with this little tank cat. And lastly, it means the government has total power. They can do whatever they want in an unlimited government. The most famous example of this, of course, would be Adolf Hitler and the Nazi government. Some types of government that are like this are communism, absolute monarchy, and a dictatorship. There are countries like this in our world right now, including the communist country of China, the country of Saudi Arabia, which has an absolute monarchy, which means the king can do whatever he wants, whether it's right or not, and a dictatorship, like in North Korea. North Korea has a very severe and angry dictator. Typically, we see limited government as good and happy, and unlimited government is sad. Levels of economic development, also known as how a country makes money. When a country is underdeveloped, they have an agricultural economy, which means farming. So they're going to grow things like vegetables and maybe raise a cow or two to sell at the market. Except for a lot of these people are going to do subsistence farming, which is farming to survive. So maybe instead of a cow, you only have a chicken that you can have lay eggs until you need to eat it. These countries have a low GDP. This means that their country makes a low amount of money. When your country has a low amount of money, you have a low standard of living. That means you might only have your needs met. Maybe enough food, maybe enough water, maybe a shelter. And when it comes to wants, those extra things, there's certainly not enough money for that. So things like phones and headphones are completely out of the question in an underdeveloped country. These people only have enough to survive, and maybe not even that. Next up is going to be a developing country. Developing countries have manufacturing economies. Notice, a manufacturing economy means people work in factories. The GDPs in this countries are kind of low, but they're getting better, slowly. And remember, if your GDP is slowly getting better, you're slowly getting more money into your country. This means most people in your country are going to have their needs met. There's going to be enough food, water, and shelter to keep everyone alive. But the wants, like phones and brand name headphones, yeah, those are still out of the question. There's just more important things. So in a developing country, it has kind of a medium GDP, so they have kind of a medium standard of living. They have needs met, but maybe not the wants. Lastly is a developed country, and this is where the United States is. It's going to have a service and technology economy. That means that we can pay other people to do stuff for us, like teach us or cut our hair. These countries have a high GDP, which means that the citizens in this country have a high amount of money and a high standard of living. Now, you may not feel like you've got a lot, but compared to the rest of the world, we're doing pretty good, even here in Pasadena. In these countries, people have their needs met. People have food, water, and some kind of shelter, usually a little bit nicer than in the other countries. And people can also have some of the wants, like cell phones and headphones. Remember, you may not feel that rich, but compared to the rest of the world, we're all doing just fine.
Hinduism is the ancient religion of India. It's the third largest religion in the world with over 1 billion followers. And the majority of Hindus do live in India, which is the only Hindu majority country in the world. For many people, it's very difficult to understand what Hinduism is, because in so many ways, it is more like a disorganized religion than an organized religion. Hinduism has no founder. It has no common language, no common deity, no common scripture, no common ritual. All of the things that we think about when we think about bounded, organized religion. Most Hindus would believe that we all have a soul, and that soul is a reflection of God. So that individual soul that we all possess means that our natures are inherently divine, that we can know God by going inside of ourselves. For Hindus, the soul is reincarnated over many lifetimes, and the goal of Hindu life is to achieve liberation from the cycle of rebirth, liberation from the cycle of suffering. For Hindus, it's not just that humans have a soul, but all sentient beings have a soul, including animals. So in India, one will see the multiplicity of depictions of the divine. You will see the divine represented in animal form, for example. One way to think about this notion of our souls being inherently divine is through the Hindu greeting of Namaste, which is a traditional greeting in India. And it literally means the divinity within me acknowledges and salutes the divinity within you. So in this simple greeting, we see a core Hindu theological belief that's articulated. In the most ancient Hindu text, the Rig Veda, there is a verse that says, God is one, but the wise call God by many names. Or truth is one, but the wise call truth by many names. So built right into the heart of the tradition is this notion of pluralism. There is no way to convert to Hinduism. It's different strokes for different folks. When I was growing up as a Hindu, my parents would tell me there are many paths up the mountain, but they're all leading to the same place. And so at its core, Hinduism has a great deal of respect for the other world religious traditions and recognizes them as equally legitimate paths to understanding ourselves and understanding God. Buddhism is the fourth largest religion in the world, and it is also a transnational religion, meaning that we find Buddhists in every country in the world, and there are a number of countries in the world that are majority Buddhist. Most Buddhists would think of themselves as belonging to one of three schools of Buddhism: Theravada Buddhism, which we find in South and Southeast Asia; Mahayana Buddhism, which we find in East Asia; and Vajrayana Buddhism, which we find in Tibet and Mongolia. Buddhism really starts with the story of Prince Siddhartha, who was born in present-day Nepal 2,500 years ago. And when he was born, a great sage came down from the mountain and told his father, the king, that your son will either be a great emperor or a great spiritual teacher. The king was determined that his son would become a great emperor, so he vowed to shield his son from the suffering and misery of the world and kept him inside the palace walls, where he lived a life of luxury and hedonism. But when Prince Siddhartha was 30 years old, he snuck outside the palace walls and saw for the first time human suffering. And he vowed not to return to the palace until he had solved the problem of human suffering. Over the next 6 years, he spent wandering through forests in India looking for truth until he finally came across a tree in northern India. And he vowed to sit under that tree in meditation until he became enlightened. 49 days later, he became enlightened, and he was known as the Buddha, which in Sanskrit means the one who has awakened. Buddhism is different than the other major world religious traditions because it is not oriented around God, but oriented around man. And what Buddha taught is that we create our own suffering, and the path out of suffering lies with us. We can alleviate suffering by changing our perception of ourselves and our world. Buddha taught that we suffer because we crave, because we're focused on ego, and because we assume things are permanent when they're actually impermanent. And for Buddha, the way not to suffer is to recognize that everything is impermanent, even ourselves, and to recognize the transitory nature of all things. And once we do that, then we can achieve nirvana. Buddhists believe that we're already enlightened Buddhas, and we just have to realize that ourselves. And for Buddhists, because the focus isn't on God, we can transform ourselves to become enlightened. We can understand the world in a particular way where we see the truth of our own natures. And in that respect, Buddhism is a self-empowering religion that many people gravitate towards because it doesn't necessitate that they worship any particular deity or engage in any other type of ritual other than meditation, contemplation, and introspection. Islam is the second largest religion in the world with over 1.5 billion followers. And like Christianity, Islam is a transnational religion, meaning that there are Muslims living in every country in the world, and there are many countries that are majority Muslim. Most Muslims will think of themselves as either Shia or Sunni, but there is tremendous diversity even within Shia Islam and within Sunni Islam that's often regionally dependent. Islam literally means submission, and so Muslims see themselves as coming to God with great humility. And for Muslims, submitting to God creates a radical sense of equality. the most sacred text for Muslims is the Holy Quran, which most Muslims believe is the direct word of God as revealed to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. And even though Muslims hold Christian and Jewish prophetic lineages as authoritative, for Muslims, the most important prophet and the final prophet is Muhammad. Muhammad brought Judeo-Christian monotheism to the Arab people about 1,300 years ago. One of the most misunderstood concepts in Islam is that of jihad, which many people interpret as a holy war. But there is nothing holy about war. And what jihad actually represents is an internal struggle, the battle that's raging in our own heart. And all of our religious traditions talk about that internal struggle. In that respect, jihad isn't just a Muslim idea, but it's a reality of the human condition. In order to understand what animates Muslim life, it's helpful to think about the 5 pillars of Islam, which is an aspiration that most Muslims around the world have. The first pillar is Shahada, or the recitation of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. The second pillar is Salat, or ritual prayer 5 times a day facing in the direction of Mecca, the holiest of Muslim sites. The third pillar is Zakat, or charitable giving to the poor. A certain percentage of your salary every year would be given for philanthropy. The fourth pillar is Ramadan, or fasting during the holy month. That month changes each year. It's based on a lunar calendar, but Muslims will generally fast for a full month. For Muslims, developing a type of self-discipline through fasting will help ensure that they are able to follow the other tenets of their faith in a way that is equally rigorous and devotional. And the fifth pillar is Hajj, or the aspiration to undertake a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your life. And through these 5 pillars, we see a global sense of community amongst Muslims, a shared sense of experience that really connects Muslims across time and space.
One of my favorite years in school was the 8th grade. I remember it well because I was 13 years old and felt like the king of junior high. That's because it was our final year of junior high and we were having a ball. I remember the winter formal, Sadie Hawkins, and more. But wouldn't it have been crazy at the age of 13 if I couldn't do all that because I had to get married? I know that sounds crazy, right? But some cultures get married at that age. It's a requirement. This reminds me of a great man in history by the name of Mohandas Gandhi. That is because when he was 13, he had to get married. Mohandas Gandhi was a legendary civil rights leader who stood up for the rights of Indian people, using acts of nonviolence through protests and fasting so he could help them achieve equality and fair treatment. Now check this out. Mohandas Gandhi was born in Porbandar, India on October 2nd, 1869. His family lived well there in India, and after he got married, they wanted him to be a lawyer. Following his parents' wishes, he went into law and eventually worked for a law firm in South Africa. This is where, as he saw people being treated bad, he knew he had to stand up and do something. There was a lot of prejudice there in South Africa against Indians, and Mohandas knew he couldn't stand for it, so he stood up against those who treated his people unfairly. You see, much of the same thing happened there when he returned home. That's right, Indian people were still being treated bad, and Mohandas started doing demonstrations by standing up to the British rule there in India. In order to try to help his people, Mohandas organized nonviolent protests, which did not make the British happy. The reason the British weren't happy was because with so many Indians protesting, it would literally shut the city down because they wouldn't show up to work or go to court, and everything was crazy. After protesting, Mohandas was also thrown in prison. This did not stop him, though, from standing up, as he fasted there in jail and would not eat. The British feared they would have a bigger problem on their hands if Mohandas died in prison due to not eating. They ended up freeing him from prison because they didn't want him to die there and make everybody angry. One of his greatest demonstrations was against a salt tax there in Britain. You see, to buy salt, the British wanted to charge extra money. In order to show that he would not stand for this tax, Mohandas walked 241 miles to the sea to make his own salt. Many other Indians saw his efforts too, and they stood up against the British government, marching along with him. These type of demonstrations inspired many civil rights leaders around the world, including the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States. Mohandas Gandhi died on January 30th, 1948, after being assassinated by a terrorist. Although his life was taken, his memory lives on in the world of civil rights, and his legacy will always be remembered. Even till this day, his birthday is a national holiday in India, and his life story serves as a reminder of the difference that the actions of one man can achieve by standing up against unfair treatment.
Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994. It was the official end of white minority rule, otherwise known as apartheid. Apartheid, you've heard of it, but what exactly was it? I'm Francesca Fiorentini, and this is AJ Plus. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means separateness. It was a system of racial segregation that governed South Africa for nearly 50 years. It specifically aimed to protect the domination of the white South Africans over non-whites in every aspect of life. But it didn't just appear out of thin air. During the colonial grab for the country between the Dutch-descended Afrikaners and the British, the rights of native black South Africans were sidelined. So when apartheid was officially made law in 1948 by the Afrikaner-led National Party, it was a continuation of injustices already happening. Afrikaners believed that South Africa was their God-given homeland, and that the white race was superior. The black majority was therefore seen as a threat. There were 148 apartheid laws. Blacks had to carry ID permits at all times and had to obey strict curfews. Public facilities were separated for white and non-white use, and marriages between whites and other races were banned. People were classified into 4 racial categories: white, black, Indian, and colored, people of mixed race. And they were all separated into different residential areas. Blacks were divided into 10 so-called homelands based on tribal groups. Homelands were rural, overcrowded, and lacked jobs, forcing blacks to seek work as migrant laborers. Wages were low, and it was illegal for workers to strike. See, apartheid was also economically motivated. A cheap workforce was needed particularly to work in the country's gold mines. Powerful mining magnates had a huge stake in apartheid policies since their profits depended on keeping black wages low. Outside their designated homelands, non-whites had no political rights. Since they were not technically citizens, they couldn't vote. Education? Also divided. The state set up a separate education system for blacks that received a fraction of the funding that white schools did. Mandatory education ended at age 13 and was structured to funnel blacks into menial migrant labor. Exploitation? By design. Needless to say, there was resistance to these insane laws. Protests were often led by black students and youth and were met with severe repression. Out of these struggles came leaders like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, who would help bring an eventual end to apartheid. So now that you know what apartheid was, could you imagine living under it? Are there any similarly unjust laws that still exist where you live? Leave us your comments below. Peace and reconciliation.